the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 20, the 2023 African Cup. This episode is looking at the players of Equatorial Guinea. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. I'm Kevin, and this is a continuation of Series 20 on the 2023 African Cup, played in January 2024. We have done a full and short version on the groups and teams, and are now looking at the players of each team, this episode covering Equatorial Guinea's players. We're doing this mediacast in two parts. So part one here is looking at the candidates for the squad and their likelihood of making it. And part two will come out when the squad lists are released, or the final rosters, and we know who is going to be at the African Cup. And we think that'll be released in early January. At that time, we'll go back over the list that we compiled today and see who made it and who didn't. And we'll also cover a few other things that I'll talk about at the end of the mediacast here. We did do a mediacast on the players of Equatorial Guinea going into the 2021 African Cup. Again, that took place in January 2022. And that mediacast provided biographies on the candidates in quite a bit of detail. And since a lot of that is still relevant, we've decided not to commit ourselves to full player mediacasts every 2 years for the African region. So we're going to be treating this one as more of an update. In that series, we were able to show who made and who didn't make the final squad, but we could only go as far as predicting the starters. So we provide a link to that mediacast in the show notes. Here we'll begin with the list that we compiled from the previous cup. We'll begin this one by reviewing those candidates and the predictions that we'd made, and we'll update the players based on their participation over the past 2 years, so basically since the last African Cup. We will thus emerge with a new list of players and their likelihood of making the squad. We're going to put a few players in the spotlight. Actually, for Equatorial Guinea, there are none, but these players will be those who are either at the likely or definite level of likelihood to reach the squad, and who were not covered in the previous mediacast for the 2021 African Cup. As I said, for Equatorial Guinea, there were no players that fit those criteria. Again, bios for most players are available through the link in the show notes, and not too outdated. And for fun, we're going to finish with our early predictions of starters, and we'll let you know what to expect in part two. Finally, before we launch into it here, we look at our past, present, and future mediacast. We've made a separate video, it's actually this title, on what we'll be covering over the next 9 months. And in fact, if you click on the links that you see right there, it brings you straight to that past, present, and future mediacast. So YouTube watchers can see that link on the screen right now, but for listeners, it can be found in the show notes, actually, for watchers and listeners both. But just to be brief, we have covered, we finished actually our initial coverage of the Asian Cup 2023. So we've done long and short podcasts for the groups and teams, and we've also covered all 24 teams players, at least part one. So we're going to do part two on those ones when the teams are released as well. For the African Cup, as mentioned, we have covered the groups and teams in a full and short version, and we're just embarking on the players now. And also we have started our coverage of World Cup 2026 qualifying. So that's just a brief of what we've been working on, and let us now begin Equatorial Guinea's players. So let's begin with the manager. And the manager last time was Juan Mika. And actually, he is the manager this time as well. So there aren't a lot of teams where the same manager is leading them through this cup. But in the case of Equatorial Guinea, there is. Let's move on then to goalkeepers and look at what was said in the previous mediacast. So we had Jesus Owono as a definite candidate. And then we had a possible but unlikely candidate in Aitor Mbella, and a player seemingly off the squad in Philippe Ovono. And that was all we had actually for part one. So we were at a bit of a loss as to what they were going to do about goalkeepers. As it turns out, when the final squad came out, they had added 2 new goalkeepers, the first being Mariano Mba and the second Manuel Sapungo. And so what ended up happening, and by the way, we had predicted Jesus Owono as the starter, and well, we'll tell you what happened there. What ended up happening is Jesus Owono was selected. Aitor Mbella, the possible but unlikely goalkeeper, was selected, but then was injured, and so he was technically replaced by Philippe Ovono. And they also brought Mba and Supunga to the cup. So they actually brought 4 goalkeepers to the cup. The roster was expanded because of COVID, so a lot of teams did bring 4 keepers. So there we have it. Now, we had predicted Jesus Owono as the starter, and we were wrong, actually. He did not start game 1. Surprisingly, Sapungo did, but we're wondering if maybe he had a niggle or something like that, because he did come back in game 2 and started the remaining 3 games. So the remaining 4 games, because actually they reached the quarterfinals there. So Jesus Owono was the starter, and the player who did play game 1 was Manuel Sapunga. So a bit of a surprise there, since he had no caps at that time. So let's see what has happened since then, or basically we'll just remove these codings that we had from last time, and see how they stand now. So we actually still have Jesus Owono as a definite candidate. Manuel Sapunga moves to being a possible candidate, and his name should be in black because he's been through a tournament now. Manuel Sapunga, and Aitor Mbella remains, or has actually moved up to being a possible candidate. This is all based on their participation over the last 2 years. And we have Philippe Mbono seemingly off the squad. He actually was selected for the squad in 2021, but did not actually appear there. So not even on the bench for any of the 5 games. So that means November 2019 was the last time Philippe Ovono played for the national team. So truly off the squad now, but there's no official retirement, so we can't put him in the retirement section. And Mariano Mba has not played since that African Cup, so he is seemingly off the squad too. And we have 1 name then to add at the possible level, and that is Marcos Ondo. So we'll just tell you what the situation looks like now. Jesus Owono is clearly going to be the starter. He started 14 of the 17 games over the past 2 years. Manuel Sapunga, we saw he replaced him in the cup for the first game of the cup, but That's the only time he replaced him. So he could be a backup keeper. But actually, in the 3 games that Jesus Owono missed over the past 2 years, it was Aitor Mbella that replaced him for those 3. So he looked like the second string keeper. However, he was not selected for the last 3 matches, and Marcos Ondo returned from an absence to be on the bench for the last 2 games. So it really could be any one of those 3 playing backup. And let's just review the names before we move on. So we have definite candidate Jesus Owono, and 3 possible candidates, probably 2 of them being brought to the cup here: Manuel Sapungo, Aitor Mbella, and Marcos Ondo. Okay, let's move on to defenders, and actually central defenders. So we go back to 2021, and this is what it looked like going into the previous cup. We had a definite candidate in Marvin Anibol, and a likely candidate in Sol Coco. 2 possible candidates, Rui de Gracia and Javier Acapo. And we also had a possible but unlikely candidate, but we're not going to mention those unless they reappear in this cup. In this case, that candidate does not. We also thought Marvin Anibo would be a starter. We were wrong in that. He was on the roster, but saw no action in the cup. Sol Coco we saw as a starter, and he was one of the starters. And he started alongside actually a player coded as a right back, Esteban Orozco. So it was Coco and Orozco starting. So Javier Acapo we thought might be a starter, maybe because we were missing Orozco's name, but actually Acapo was just on the bench there. And not even on the bench, actually. He was on the bench for games 1 and 2 and not 3, 4, and 5. So Javier Acapo, we were quite wrong on. Now, let's see how things have changed. So we'll remove those highlights that we had for the 2021 Cup. And we'll begin with Aniboa, and he moves down to being a possible candidate now. Based on his participation over the past 2 years. Sol Coco remains as a likely candidate, and we're going to add Esteban Orozco, the right back, who actually played as a central defender there. And we're adding another name here at the likely level in Jose Elo. There, and Rui de Gracia is gone from the team. He last appeared in September 2021, and as we said, I don't think we did say, Javier Acapo also no longer on the squad, last appearing in June 2022. And we have 1 more name to add at the possible level, and that's Luis Henrique Nsue. And actually he was on our list last time, but he hadn't played enough games for us to know what his position was, so we had him in the general defender category below. It turns out he was a central defender, and he did make the squad actually, but he was on the roster and saw no action, and even a couple of games he wasn't even on the bench. Anyway, so there we have it. Likely candidates Esteban Orozco and Sol Coco and Jose Elo. We're not going to do a spotlight on Jose Elo because even though he's likely to make the final squad, he's consistently a substitute. He's only started 1 game, so doesn't kind of meet our criterion there. And we also have possible candidates Marvin Anibo and Luis Henrique Nsue. And that's about the number of central defenders we expect them to bring to the Cup. So it may be that all 5 of those make it. Just a quick note on who's been starting. Really, it was a kind of a rotation near the end, especially among Coco, Orozco, and Luis Enrique Nsue. And we would have had Enrique Nsue as a likely candidate here, except that he wasn't selected for the last 3 games. And so in the last games, it went back to exactly what it was in the Cup. It was Coco and Orozco, and that's pretty much what we expect to see in this Cup, at least as a starting central defensive pair. Okay, let's move on to the left-back position, and once again, we'll go back to the previous Cup and see what we had on our list there. So we had likely candidate Luis Messager, and also likely Basilio Ndong. And we also had a possible candidate in Cosme Anvin. And again, we had a player who seemed to be off the squad, who indeed was off the squad because he hasn't reappeared. So we have these 3 candidates. We saw Luis Messager as a starter, and we also saw Basilio Ndong as a starter. So I'm not sure what we were thinking there. Maybe we saw one of them as starting out of position. I honestly can't remember. And we saw Cosme Anvin as a backup player, a substitute. As it turned out, it was Basilio Ndong that started all 5 games. And Luis Messager didn't start at all. He appeared only very briefly in game 1, subbing in at 88, and then was basically off the team and has been off the team for the most part. We are moving. Okay, I'll get to that a little bit later. Anyway, he wasn't the starter that we thought he was going to be. Cosme Anvin lived up to our expectations. He was a substitute on the roster and saw no action in the tournament. Okay, let us remove the highlights there then and see how things have developed since. And as I said a bit sooner than I should have, Luis Messager now moves down to the possible but unlikely level. He's been on the bench for only 1 of their last 12 games. Meanwhile, Basilio Ndong has become a definite candidate. Believe it or not, he has started all 17 of their games over the past 2 years. It's quite rare to see that. And I got to say, actually, 2 of those were as a central defender. So not all of them as a left back. So that did leave 2 games for Cosme Anvin to step into. And he also started twice as a central defender. So he has 4 starts. So Cosme Anvin will be at the likely level now, but we don't think he'll be a starter. We think he'll be a supporting player. Okay, and I do believe that that covers it, because I said Ndong started all 17. So he seems to have the position nailed down there, the left back position. So I think we've finished our business here. So I'll just summarize. We have Basilio Ndong as a definite candidate, likely candidate Cosme Anvin, and that's it. That's all we have for that position. Position, because we're only going to do up to the possible level. Okay, right backs. Let's look at the candidates that we had back in going into the previous tournament. So we had actually 3 likely candidates: Carlos Acapo, Miguel Angel May, and Esteban Orozco, who we've dealt with above. And I'll erase him from the list here because we have dealt with him. We thought of him as a right back and possibly a starter. Turns out that he was a starter, but as a central defender, and we'll remove him from the list of right backs. But I should say he has played right back a couple of times over the past couple of years. Okay. We also had a possible candidate in Nestor Senra, and we had a retired candidate who we won't put on the list here. So let's see what happened there. We had Carlos Acapo as a starter, and we were right. He was the starting right back in all 5 games. And Miguel Angel May, we thought might be a starter, but it turns out he appeared only in 1 game. Oh no, he didn't appear in any of the games there, so no field action. And Nestor Senra did not make the squad last time and is now no longer. Oh no, hang on, I'm going to leave him there because he is still on the books, as it were. So let's remove the 2021 highlights and see how things have developed. So we still have Carlos Acapo as a likely candidate. He's playing in the USA, so he has missed actually 9 of their 17 matches, but we wonder if that's because he can't really travel. He's not only in the USA, he's on the west side of the USA playing for the San Jose Earthquake, so that's a very long trip. So he had started half of the games, the one that he has shown up for, but he hasn't shown up for half of the games. So Carlos Acapo, we still think he's a likely candidate. Miguel May, we moved down to the possible but unlikely category. He wasn't selected for the last 5 games. So he did play after the African Cup there, but not played for the last games. Meanwhile, Nestor Senra remains at the possible level because he started 3 of their 17 games and was called up for the last 3 games there. So Nestor Senra, a possible candidate. Again, we have no spotlight players here because none of the Senra is the only new one, and he doesn't look likely enough to be a starter to put in the spotlight. And in fact, we're not confident that we're not really confident about starters here because Carlos Acapo has only started half of the games. So it's been a bit of a mix as a right back with Orozco there sometimes and some other players coming in. Senra 3 times and some out of position players, usually central defenders, coming in. So there we go. But we will deal with who we think are going to be starters at the end. Let's move on now to the midfield, and we start with defensive midfielders. So back in oh, hang on, I'm just going to go back to general midfielders here because no, we've already dealt with Luis Enrique Nsue. We did have him, I think, as a new candidate when the rosters were published there in Nsue, and we do see now he's a possible central defender. Okay, now defensive midfielders. We didn't have any candidates back going into the previous cup, just one who seemed to be off the squad, and it proved that he was off the squad, so we won't introduce him here. But we do have one new candidate at the possible level, and it's Javier Mum. And Javier Mum, well, that's all we have to say, really. A new candidate at the possible level. And otherwise the candidates are all at the central midfield level. So let's go back to the previous cup and see what we were thinking. We had Pablo Ganet as a definite candidate and Pedro Obiang also as a definite candidate. We had likely candidate Pepin. And I think we had some confusion, and I'm not sure if it was during the podcast or during my preparation for the podcast, but This player goes by two names, basically. On some sources, he's called Jose Machin, and on other sources, he's called Pepin. So that created some confusion for us. We're going to go with Jose Machin, but you might hear him called Pepin there. We had two possible candidates in Alex Balboa and Janik Bovla. Janik Boyla. Okay, well, let's see how that turned out. Actually, Pablo Ganet was selected as we expected. However, Pedro Obiang was not. He was injured, so not selected due to injury. And excuse me, that was a bit of a loss for Equatorial Guinea. Jose Machin was selected, the likely candidate, as were both possible candidates, Alex Balboa and Janik Boyla. In terms of our predictions of starters, we thought Pablo Ganet would be a starter, and indeed he was. We also thought Jose Machin would start, and he did start all 5 games there. Alex Balboa was just a substitute, just came in actually one game, but Janik Boyla got a bit more action. He started 3 of the games as a right attacking midfielder, actually, or a right winger. So he saw more action than we expected. Let's see how things have progressed since then. So now we will remove the highlights there from 2021. And Pablo Ganet, we have now as a likely candidate. He started 12 of their 17 games. Pedro Obiang has drifted further from the team down to the possible level. We should get rid of that name. And Janik Boyla and Balboa both move up to the possible but likely level. So that's both move up to the likely level, and that's based on their participation over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, Jose Machin moves down to the possible level. So all of them are still involved to various degrees. And we don't have any new players to introduce into the mix here. So again, it's conceivable that 5 central midfielders will come. It'll be interesting to see if Pedro Obiang makes it this time. Okay, let us move on to... well, we did have one player as a left midfielder, and that was Federico Bicaro. But we're going to actually move him up to attacking midfielder now, because he actually plays centrally, not always as an attacking midfielder, but sometimes a central or even defensive midfielder. But he's really not correctly coded as a right midfielder. So we'll come back to him. As a left midfielder. On the right midfield, we have 2 candidates at the possible level. Hang on, I just got to see what we had before. Yeah, so last time we had Federico Bicaro as a definite candidate, but we moved him there. On the right, we had 2 possible but unlikely candidates in 2021 going into that cup. We're actually going to put one of them back on the list here because he remains a candidate. That's Jonette or Jonette Lopez, sometimes called just Jonette. But we have, neither of those, Jonette Lopez didn't make it to the cup last time. But is still kind of in and around. So Jonette Lopez now we put at the possible level based on participation, and actually he plays as a left winger and a right winger. So again, right midfield, not exactly the right designation for him. Nevertheless, we'll leave them here. We have another possible candidate in Federico Nsue, sometimes called Federico Nguema, or even Fedi Nguema. And he is also a possible candidate. We don't have too much more to say about that because none of them look like starters. They're actually, Joe Net has started 4 games, as we said, 2 on the left wing and 2 on the right wing, but not selected for the last 4 matches. So that's why we have him as a possible candidate. Let's move upfield to the left wing and see what we had last time. So we had Jose Miranda as a likely candidate. And that was the only candidate we had coded as a left winger. And consequently, we thought Jose Miranda would be the starter in the Cup. As it turned out, Miranda was on the bench, was actually not even on the bench for game 1, was just a sub in game 2, and then gained a starting position for the remaining 3 games. So maybe some problem at the beginning prevented him from playing at first. Okay, so we will remove that highlight and see what his position is now. And actually, he moves up from a likely to a definite candidate, having started 11 of their 17 games. And I should say, by the way, that the central midfielder Boyla was the player who played in this position in the Cup when Miranda wasn't playing there. But over the past 2 years, Miranda has usually been there, and we consider him a definite candidate to make it. We also have a new candidate coming into this spot, and that is Charles Ondo. And he comes in at the likely level because of his participation. He's new in March, but has been selected regularly since, but doesn't look like a starter. In fact, he hasn't started any of their games. So we're not putting him in the spotlight because he, despite being regularly called up, is not a starter. So we're kind of being a starter regularly enough is one of the criterion for that. So there we have it, a definite candidate in Jose Miranda, and a likely candidate, though probably a substitute, in Charles Ondo. Let's move over to the right wing, and it's a very similar situation. We just had one player at the likely category going into the last cup, and that was Ruben Belima. But here we were quite wrong. We predicted Ruben Belima would be a starter, and he was not. He was just a substitute coming into 3 games, and rather it was the secondary striker Iban Salvador, who started as right wing and right attacking midfielder in all 5 games. So Ruben Belima, not a starter. Let's see how things have developed since there. So I've already removed the highlight, and we're actually moving Iban Salvador into this position now because he continues to play on that side, and so we're going to put Iban Salvador actually as a definite candidate as a right winger. Meanwhile, Ruben Belima is off the squad, having last played in June 2022, so seemingly off the squad there. So that leaves us with just our definite candidate, Iban Salvador, and we should note that sometimes he and the left winger, Jose Miranda, do switch sides from time to time, but Iban Salvador, our definite candidate. Okay, let's move on to attacking midfielders. Hang on, no, we have a couple of general midfielders here as well. So I'll just introduce those. Just like general defenders, we have two at the possible level. So these are two new additions. So we don't need to go back to the previous cup to look at these players. Rafa Nsoko is at the possible level. And we don't know what kind of a midfielder he is because he has no caps for the national team. And the same is true with Mansueto Nguema. So you may wonder why I'm putting them on, especially at the possible level. And that's because Nsogo came in June 2022 and June 2023, and was on the bench for a game, actually, just a game, not selected for the last three matches. And in Nguema, it was came in for the last three games and was on the bench for one and not selected for the last two matches. So maybe that's possible, but unlikely. But because it's recent, we put them as possible. Okay, let's move on to attacking midfielders and look at the situation in prior to the previous cup. And at that time, we had a possible candidate in Santiago Eneme and a possible but unlikely candidate who we won't mention because he is off the squad. So not much to work with there. Well, let's see what happened. We thought that Santiago Eneme would be kind of a substitute, and that turned out to be true. He wasn't on the bench for game one, and he subbed into 3 games there. So Santiago Eneme living up to our expectations, and we'll leave him on the list because he is still a candidate. And let's see how things have developed. So actually we have moved Federico Bicoro here and put him as a definite candidate, not necessarily playing as an attacking midfielder, because as I said, he also plays as a central or defensive midfielder, but we will move him here because attacking midfield's where he has been the most. Meanwhile, Santiago Eneme has moved up from a possible level last time to a definite level this time. He's almost always called up, even though he's more of a substitute. So he did start 4 of the 17 games, but he was subbed in for 8 and on the bench for 2. So that's Santiago Eneme, a definite candidate. And we have a possible candidate, a new one, Jesus Mansogo, at the possible level. And yes, those are our candidates for attacking midfield. So recently we've seen Bicore in this role. Eneme has been there a few times, and also surprisingly the central midfielder Machin or Pepin sometimes in this role. But we do see Federico Bicoro as a starting player. We'll get to that at the end here. Though not necessarily in this position. Okay, let's go. Secondary strikers. Last time we did have Iban Salvador at the likely level, but we moved him now to the right wing position and up to a definite for this cup. So that leaves us with no candidates for secondary strikers here. So we move on to the forwards. Going into the last cup, we had 2 definite candidates in Emilio Nsue and in Oscar Siafa. We had 2 likely candidates in Luis Nalalbo and Solomon Obama. 1 possible candidate in Dorian Jr. and 1 possible candidate in possible but unlikely candidate in Pedro Oba Asu. Pedro Asu. Now, in terms of what we thought Emilio Nsue and Oscar Siafa would be starters. That was our prediction. And it turns out that we were right about Emilio Nsue in terms of him starting game one. However, he lost his starting position for most of the tournament. He did return as a starter in game 5. So it turns out to have been a rotation then between or among Nsue, Dorian Jr., who, by the way, is called Hansa sometimes, Dorian Hansa, and Oscar Safia, who started one of the games there, game 2. So that was the situation. Now let's remove the highlights, having done our 2021 business. And let's see where the players stand now. So Emilio Nsue still as a definite candidate there based on his recent participation. Dorian Jr. Has moved up to a likely level, whereas Oscar Safia has moved down to the possible level there. Lewis and Lavo, just a substitute really in the cup and since the cup too, but we still have Lewis and Lavo at a possible level. And Obama Salaman, he wasn't actually selected for the squad in the first place, so we should have removed him from the list earlier. And the possible but unlikely candidate, Pedro Oba Asu, he turned out to not play for the squad. He last appeared actually in September 2022, but it was the African national or nations championship matches. That's a competition where only African-based players can play. As far as the actual team goes, he didn't appear after the African Cup, so he was selected, but appeared only as a substitute and hasn't been selected since. Okay, so let's summarize that. That it means we have Emilio Nsue as a definite forward, Dorian Jr. or Dorian Hansa as a likely candidate, and Oscar Siafa and Lewis and Lavo as possible candidates. And we have to add one possible candidate new to the squad, No Ila. So he's just a 20-year-old player with Numancia in Spain joining the squad. All right, that brings us to the end, and that's what the list looks like going into this tournament. So now we're going to move into our closing section, part 3, and we will talk about players that we think are in the spotlight, are going to be starters for the tournament. So manager Juan Micha, still manager after 2021 African Cup, staying on. Goalkeepers, it's pretty obvious. There's Jesus Uwono, I should say, and we can identify 2 central defenders, but I'm not 100%. I'm about 85 on these 2 starting. But Esteban Orozco and Sol Coco look like they're going to be starting just like they did 2 years ago. Left back, though, there's absolutely no doubt in Basilio Ndong. As on the right, though, I'm not confident enough to nominate a starter for that position, so we're going to leave that one blank. In the central midfield, again, I'm 90% sure on Pablo Gannett starting, but it'll be kind of a rotation of players alongside him. I don't see any being a starter. Next on the left wing, fairly confident about Josep Miranda, and even more confident on the right wing about the tricky Iban Salvador starting in that position. Central attacking midfield, not necessarily in that position. We think Federico Bicoro will definitely be a starter, and probably attacking midfield, but quite possibly 2 as a central or even defensive midfielder. And finally, I'd say with about 75% conviction, Emilio Nsue as the starting forward. All right, that brings us to the end. So we'll just do a kind of a quick preview of part 2. I won't even go into the details suggested by the graphics here. We're basically going to go back over the list once we know what the final squad is, and we'll see how correct we were in our predictions, but more importantly, who made the squad and who didn't. And another important part of the part 2 of the podcast, another important section, will be giving an update on any injuries at that time. So we hope you seek us out then. We originally planned to tag on our past, present and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We would like to thank Pixabay and Alexei Ivanov of Mappa Music for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast.